Hey everyone, I'm your host Malick Mercier, and this is GBH's Why It Matters, the history series where we use the past to explain the present. In the 2016 election, Donald Trump lost the popular vote, but won the Electoral College and thus the presidency. This isn't the first time this has happened in US history. There have been 4 other presidents who lost the popular vote, but won the election, the first being President John Quincy Adams in 1824. But if the United States is a democracy, why aren't presidents elected by popular vote? Why do we have this complicated system that sometimes picks the person who did not win the popular vote? Here to explain the roots of the Electoral College and to help us connect the past to the present is Professor Alexander Keyssar. Professor Keyssar, welcome to the show.
It's a pleasure to be here, Malick.
So Professor Keyssar, let's dive right in. How do we pick our presidents in the United States?
Thanks for that question, Malick. And we pick presidents in the United States in a very complicated and unusual way. Basically, although it is the President of the United States, we do not have a single national election, but we have an assembly of 50 state elections. The elections are run by the states. Each state votes to choose electors who will eventually cast their electoral votes for candidates for president. In most states, the way the system works is that whoever wins the popular vote in the state will get all of that state's electoral votes. The number of electoral votes is largely, but not entirely, in proportion to its population. A state gets electoral votes based on the number of members of the House of Representatives, plus 2 each for the Senate. Those electoral votes are then cast in the states, transmitted to Congress where they are counted and approved, and that leads to the selection of the president.
The announcement of the state of the vote by the President of the Senate shall be deemed a sufficient declaration of the persons elected President and Vice President of the United States, each for the term beginning on the 20th day of January, 2021.
Can you tell us about how and why the founders created the Electoral College?
The founders created the Electoral College as a set of compromises and experiments. When they gathered, nobody had much experience with what the chief executive of a republic would look like. The models of chief executives were kings. And so the question was, when they got there, was, well, how do we choose this president? The default option in most people's minds was that Congress would choose the president. And then every time they would have a straw vote on that, they'd back off and say, that's a bad idea. There's no separation of powers. And then got into mid to late August in Philadelphia. They'd already been there for months. It was hot and humid. They still didn't have a solution. So what the Constitutional Convention did was basically to go on vacation and left a committee behind. And it was up to this committee to come up with a solution. That's what they did. They came up with a proposal for something like the Electoral College. They did not know how it would work. It was an experiment and a set of compromises made by very, very talented but very tired men at the end of August of 1787.
So, Professor, there have been some attempts to change the system over the years. What have been the critics' biggest arguments against the Electoral College?
Efforts to change the way the system worked began, practically within hours of when it was adopted. There have been probably 1,000 or more formal constitutional amendments introduced into Congress to try to get rid of the Electoral College. It has been a very unpopular institution since the outset. As long as we've had public opinion polls, between 60 and 80% of the American people have wanted to just have a national popular vote. But I think the major criticisms are that it's not democratic in the sense that it's not a system that conforms with the principle of one person, one vote. Because it does that, it contains the possibility that the person who wins the popular vote will not win the Electoral College vote and will not become president. And that has happened in our lifetimes twice. But in 2000 and 2016, that has happened. And that is also a very serious criticism.
And so, given all the criticism, why do you think the Electoral College has endured?
I think there are several reasons that the Electoral College has endured. One has to be mentioned, disturbing as it is for us as we reflect on American history, which is that for many years, the Electoral College was preserved by forces that were benefiting from white supremacy in the South. Predominantly white or entirely white political parties resisted changes to the presidential election system. When they were coming together in Philadelphia in 1787, there was a disagreement. Southerners wanted representation in Congress based on their entire population. And Northerners responded by saying, wait, you can't get representation on behalf of slaves who don't vote. And what resulted was the compromise, the 3/5 compromise. During the antebellum era, when there was slavery, southern states, which received electoral votes in proportion to their white population plus 3/5 of their black populations, had power that was not distributed among the slaves, obviously, and the slaves couldn't vote. So this meant that white Southerners who did vote were wielding more power than people elsewhere in the country. But it was also true after the Civil War and after slavery, when African Americans were disenfranchised in much of the South from about 1890 into the 1960s. The Electoral College, as structured, gives a power to states, gives influence to states in proportion to their population, largely, not in proportion to the number of people who vote. Abolishing or replacing or seriously reforming the Electoral College requires a constitutional amendment, and a constitutional amendment is difficult to pass in the United States. It requires a 2/3 vote in each branch of Congress, followed by the approval of a supermajority of states. There have been, less than 30 constitutional amendments passed in the history of the United States, and in fact, less than 20 since 1790. It's a very difficult thing to do.